Okay, well, Acts 24 is a good place to start, at least for a few minutes, because both of the first two characters pretty much are coming from around that spot. And then we'll be flipping over to 2 Kings to look at the third one. Felix and Festus. It's fitting. Their names are so close together alphabetically, and their stories are so close together biblically. Felix, we shouldn't have to spend too much time on these because we kind of touched on them at least a tad earlier whenever we looked at Agrippa II and Bernice, because they also fall in this little section here. Felix, which means happy or prosperous, his legacy was he was a cruel Roman governor of Judea who was appointed by the Emperor Claudius, and who, despite trembling upon hearing Paul speak, sent him away wanting nothing more than money from him. He didn't want anything from Paul but money. But really, I think his legacy is mainly that middle part. He's the one who trembled when Paul spoke to him about righteousness, godliness, how does it put it? Judgment, righteousness, the judgment, and, well, we'll see. Self-control and the coming judgment. He trembled, but he said, go away for now until an opportune time. That's his legacy. That's Felix. It's easy to get Felix and Festus mixed up. I have in the past. Felix came first. They had the same job. They're the same role. Just Festus took Felix's place. So I've pretty much already said the whole thing, but what we learn about Felix from the Scriptures, now other testimony may tell us a little bit more about him, which is why our handout, threw the word cruel in there. He was what's happening? Oh, I turned it off. He was a cruel governor. We may not see that too much in this narrative, other than the fact that he just kept Paul in prison for no reason. Felix, a couple interesting things. The first one is in verse 22 of Acts 24. It says, he had a rather accurate knowledge of the way. That statement has always puzzled me a little bit because Luke doesn't give anything. He doesn't provide any explanation. The nature of his rather accurate knowledge, like what exactly did he know about it? How had he learned it? Why did he know it? It's one of those things that, we'd like to hear more about. But that's how he brings this up. Felix had a rather accurate knowledge of the way, but he was indecisive about Paul. Says, well, when Lysias comes, I'll decide your case. I don't want to be bothered now. I'll deal with it later. That's why he's called, one reason why we're calling him the man who procrastinated. Now, there could be tons of people named that. The man who procrastinated. That's every man in here, probably. Well, I remember one time when I procrastinated, but he procrastinated in more than one way. One of them was far more severe than the other. So, in this case, he procrastinated by not wanting to deal with Paul. I got other things to do. I don't want this case. I don't want to deal with this right now. I'll deal with it when Lysias comes, the tribune. So he just said, okay, keep him here, but let his friends come and, let people in and out, whatever. He can't go anywhere, but his friends don't prevent his friends and his companions, whatever, from coming in to seeing him and attending to his needs. After all, that'd make his job also easier, wouldn't it? Not only am I not going to deal with it, but if we let his people come in and attend to his needs, we won't have to. Smart. in one way. But it says, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla. I think we looked at her too, which is why we may have looked at Felix a little bit, who was Jewish, or maybe we saved her. I can't remember if we looked at her or not. He sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Jesus Christ. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix, according to the ESV, was alarmed. Or, as I already said, trembled. Any others? Anybody got anything besides alarmed and trembled? Was afraid, I see. Was terrified. Acts 24:25. So alarmed, trembled, terrified, afraid. I think that's about all we're going to get. Had great fear, I see. Frightened. All things that describe a response that could be a good thing. Has anybody ever been at least a little bit wary or afraid when you hear about the coming judgment? Surely, at least a little, in a sense, it's natural, because any kind of deadline like that, any kind of day that's been appointed when God is going to judge, or when you're going to be judged at all about anything, can make you anxious. So, sounds like he started with having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, and now he's listening to Paul speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Now, he's listening to Paul talk about righteousness and self-control, and he's struck by it. Yep.
I don't know if I wrote this note in here. It's something you brought up before, but mine says became frightened. And then out inside of the Greek for that term means was becoming terrified.
Okay. Becoming terrified. The force of it, yeah. Yeah, that's very rarely reflected in the English translations, it looks like. I only see a couple that they actually sort of translated it that way. The Lexham English Bible is the only one I see actually. He became afraid, which is still not quite was becoming. It's kind of an interesting phrase that may not sound natural in English, and that's why maybe some translations didn't translate it that way. But it is interesting to know that's the actual force of the verb. He was becoming afraid, like a progressive thing almost. And we also get the idea that, I think it's Felix, talking about getting them mixed up. It seems, yes, it is Felix, that this was probably an ongoing thing. I'm not even sure if what's said in verse 25 is just talking about a one-time conversation they had. It may have been an ongoing thing, Paul talking about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. And, during this time, he was increasingly becoming afraid. So, sounds all good so far, doesn't it? From a, trying to convert somebody perspective. However, the result of his alarm or his fear was to say, okay, go away for now. Go back to your room, or whatever chamber he was in. When I get an opportunity, I'll summon you again. Then there's this element. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. But that little detail sort of underlies some ulterior motive here. Sure, he summoned him, he sent for him often and conversed with him. They had these conversations. But what he was really hoping for was that Paul was going to slip him some billage, some coinage. And then 2 whole years go by. and Felix gets replaced. So it's easy. I mean, so many sermons have probably been preached based on, not about Felix, but based on the concept of saying, I'm going to wait. Something that Paul said made him think to the point of, I'm afraid of the way I would be judged. But then he pushed it away. It came into his mind, probably unbidden, but he pushed it out. Sometimes it's good to push out bad thoughts. But if your negative thought is based on something that you should have a negative thought about, maybe the better course, definitely the better course is, let's deal with that to make the negative thing not be negative anymore, which in his case would have been obeying the gospel, but he didn't. Yeah. 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 I mean, he, ironically, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the thing that he feared, he made it become reality because he didn't act. Plus, you got to give Paul some credit for talking to somebody like him. We don't get a whole lot of information about him, but based on people that are, historical figures that are like him and in his kind of position, like the Herods and such, for Paul to talk to a man like that about self-control took some guts, because generally they didn't have any of that. Just think about, Herod with Herod Antipas and John the Baptizer, talking, you shouldn't have, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, and look how that ended. Not because of Herod, but because of the wife he's talking about. So the man who procrastinated, I thought, is kind of poetic. It is poetic. A play off of that hit song in David's day. Saul has slain his thousands, and David slain his 10,000s. The handout, the author said, yesterday slays its thousands. Tomorrow slays its tens of thousands. Because for a lot of people, they get hung up on the past and their past sins, and maybe don't ever get over their past sins. But for more people, probably, it's the tomorrow that gets them, because they don't fulfill it. They don't fulfill whatever resolution or vow or promise they might make, and they fail to realize that now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. So it's a scary thought. He was right to be afraid, but where he messed up is, okay, that'll be all. That convenient season never came. And he would regret it forever. Will. Okay, now Festus then. 2 years pass by. Felix is succeeded by Festus. Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, so he left Paul in prison. So now Festus has inherited Paul. Probably knew nothing about his case, didn't know who he was, why he was here. He has taken Felix's place, so now he's just got to deal with, okay, what are we working with? What do we got here? Festus is his legacy as the successor of Felix. Ultimately mocked Paul as somebody who was insane. So long story short, Festus, now that he's inherited this prisoner, he wants to hear his case. So Paul delivers his case to him, explains it. This is whenever Agrippa and Bernice come in, that potentially incestuous couple, who wanted to hear him. And then when Paul explained it to him, far from being like Felix was, no trembling here, not that Luke mentions. Instead, he sort of bursts out in a mocking cry of, "You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. You've been spending a little too much time in your books, and it's driving you crazy." What a legacy to have, to be the one who, after the Apostle Paul pours out this defense and about his conversion, his response is, and not to mention about that Moses and all the prophets said the Christ must suffer and he'll be the first to rise from the dead, and so on and so forth. And his reaction is, "You're out of your mind." Sadly, there are a lot of people like that, aren't there? That would also say that, or at least think it. Think that anybody that believes what Paul said has been driven insane or is insane. So he's not alone in that, but at least in his case, it burst out of his mouth. Maybe because Agrippa and Bernice were there and he was trying to look cool in front of them. But rather than saying something complimentary or being moved by Paul, "You're crazy," and that's the end of it. We don't really see anything else of Festus except that Agrippa tells him, "You could have set this guy free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar." And crazy or not crazy, you're mad. One word. Mad. Crazy. Okay. Gehazi. You know who Gehazi is? He was the servant of Elisha. Or, to put it this way, he was the servant of the prophet Elisha who ultimately made up a lying story to tell Naaman. You know, Naaman, leprosy, the leper who came, Syrian official, or a general or some kind of military leader. He made up a lying story to tell Naaman to receive the generous gift that Elisha had refused. So Naaman wanted to give Elisha this great gift, but he wouldn't take it. So Gehazi coveted that. He couldn't believe that he would turn down all that money. So he made something up so that he could get it. And ultimately, he was smitten with leprosy that Naaman had been cured of. His name means Valley of Vision or Denier. Sounds quite a bit different, but Valley of Vision maybe is more likely. What's interesting, never occurred to me before until putting this together, the possibility or the concept of Gehazi possibly being to Elisha what Elisha was to Elijah, which put him in a pretty solemn, a grave role, and should have been, he should have had a lot more integrity, or a lot of integrity, been an honorable man like Elisha. But sadly, what we see is something a little different. He fell short. He is the man who was unholy amid holiness. So all this time with Elisha, by the way, it also never occurred to me that Gehazi may be the servant whose eyes were opened to see the army of angels that I periodically refer to pretty regularly, how they have more men than we do, and Elisha prayed that God would open his eyes. He's not named there, which may suggest that it's not him, because Elisha may have had other servants, we don't know. But it's still interesting. Never thought Gehazi was his servant, and this man was his servant, so maybe that's Gehazi. But anyway, he was around righteousness all the time in Elisha, around holiness, and yet it apparently never sunk in. Not deep enough. Thought that it was an interesting comment in the handout there. It is possible in our time for a man to build churches and yet be a destroyer of Christian doctrine. Isn't it? A lot of men build churches, and not just ones that are in God. They're destroying Christian doctrine all the while they're building the churches. But it is a pretty stark contrast between Elisha and Gehazi. Elisha being who he was, we already looked at him very recently. He was a very humble, yet powerful and effective prophet, helped people. He's the one, all the lowly things, the axe head in the river, got that, the poison stew pot, all these little everyday things, you might say, down to earth people. He was helping them. As our handout says, Gehazi was familiar with sacred things, yet a stranger to their power. Lived with good men, had a knowledge of God, but succumbed to the hardening influence of spiritual things. Gehazi had the incapacity to understand a saint. He did not, all that time with Elisha, and it seems that he never could get him, like in a way that would move him to be like him. Like, I see in this man what should be in a man. For him, it seems, based on his behavior, he didn't look at Elisha like that. Yeah, Dean? Yep, good example. For whatever reason, the example of Jesus and even the others didn't sink into his heart. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mothers and fathers raise their children in the church, and the children, we can't ride on somebody else's coattails. It has to set within each one of us.
Yep, and we can't put something into somebody else's heart. We can try, and we can put it into their ears or eyes, but that's as far as we can reach, isn't it? I mean, with the example and teaching. So sometimes we're to blame, but not every time. And I don't think there's any doubt that Elisha was not to blame for his servant, right-hand man, not living up to what he should have. I think we all, at some point, we all have been. But is the bright side of that, not is. He was enslaved in his youth. Evil thoughts, greed, deliberate lying. He prostituted a strong and imaginative mind. Let's just look at that for just a second. It's 2 Kings 5. Naaman, we know the whole story with Naaman. He's a Syrian, a commander of the army of the king of Syria, which is a detail that may be forgotten sometimes, came from Syria. And that he had been helped by God in victory, in military victory, another detail that could be very easily overlooked. He comes, Elisha tells him what to do, but he brings this gift, naturally, because that's what they would do. I got to bring him something. This man of God I've heard about, I'm wanting him to heal me. I'm going to bring him something. Obviously, Elisha said, I don't want any of your stuff. Leave me out of this. Jehovah's the one who's doing this. Tells him what to do. So Gehazi, like Dean brought up Judas, it's kind of like Judas, that woman, I forget which woman, if she's even named, it may be one of the ones where they're not named. She broke the oil and poured it on Jesus, and he says, what are you doing? kind of. And not just Judas, but the others were kind of thrown off by this too. But Judas especially, it's like, this, we could have sold this for money and given to the poor. You see, he couldn't understand why somebody would do that. Well, Gehazi apparently, he's witnessed Elisha refuse the gift that he brought here to give to him. Wanted to give it to him. He saw Elisha say no, and in his mindset, he just could not understand what kind of a person refuses a gift like that. Yeah.
Also, we got to remember that Naaman, he was going to do what the prophet Elijah said, except for that here, he was the one that told him, if he would have told you to do a great thing, wouldn't you have done it? He had that characteristic about him, and he was actually got Naaman to change his mind.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Gehazi who said that, but yeah, but yeah, that's fine. He still, there had to be something about him because Elisha chose him as his sidekick, and he remained his side. I mean, up to I guess a point, but his downfall is the tragedy because in verse 15 it says 2 Kings 5 it says, "Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant." Then he refuses, and he said, "Go in peace." But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, "See, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As Jehovah lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi followed Naaman, and he caught up to him and he said, "All is well. My master has sent me to say, I've changed my mind." That's the extreme paraphrase version that I've just made up. My master, wait a minute, whoa, hold up. Remember, he said he didn't want it. He changed his mind. There's two young men of the sons of the prophets. There have just come to me 2 young men from the sons of the prophets. Please give me them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. Naaman gave it to him. He was happy. Remember, he wanted to give Elisha. He felt bad. I want to give you this. He wouldn't take it. So he just makes up this story and says, Elisha told me, he sent me after you to say, well, there's some of it we could use. He wanted it for himself. It's kind of interesting why he didn't say more. 2 talents of silver and a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. Naaman says, "Here, have 2 talents." Instead of saying, "I want all of it," maybe because he thought he could be more likely to get away with it. Maybe if he just restrained himself to this small amount. But it was still a horrible thing to do. Made it up totally. Elisha did the right thing, an honorable thing, didn't want to receive it. But he was greedy and wanted it. And rather than just leaving it at that, he went after it. Kind of like David did. He could have left it at that too and not go after it. But he went after what he wanted too. And Gehazi went back. He obviously doubted Elisha because wouldn't you think he would have known that Elisha may have had a way of having an inkling that he may have done that? He goes back in. Elisha says, "Where you been?" And he answered like a typical kid. "What are you doing?" What's the answer? Nothing. "Where you been?" "Nowhere." That's what he said. Nowhere. Now he's just come back in. It says he went in and stood before his master. Elisha said, "Where you been?" He said, "Nowhere." But Elisha said, Did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow. Pretty heavy. Yes. It's interesting to think about, maybe. I mean, that's kind of what he says. Now, that is literally the end of the story, you know, so we don't know the rest, but it seems to have been some sort of lasting thing. Of course, that could open some questions on its own, but as much as he should have known Elisha, why would he think he'd get away with that? It's fascinating. He says, my heart went, according to the ESV. My heart went. What verse is that? 26. Some versions add with you in italics. I guess that's them trying to help. It makes more sense in English, but sometimes it doesn't help. But did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? See, he saw the whole thing apparently. Yeah. He knew exactly what he did, even when he asked him, where you been? Just like when God said, where are you? He knew where they were. He knew where he had been. But he gave him an opportunity. It's the same thing I believe that God was doing for Adam and Eve. By asking, where are you and what have you done? And with Cain, all of that, God's given them a chance to confess on their own. Just like we might with a child. Even when you know what they did, it's better if they confess it. If you admit it, rather than lying or denying, it'll be a lot better for you, and it's a powerful life lesson. Well, I think Elisha's probably doing the same thing here, giving him a chance. But he failed again, lied. So a lie to cover up a lie. Elisha knew it the whole time, and he suffered the leprosy of Naaman. I guess not literally the exact leprosy. I mean, it would be one thing if Naaman was standing there, a leper, and this happened. And he's like, okay, boom, and, there it goes from him to him. But he obviously just means you're going to be a leper like Naaman was. And sadly, that's the end of it. We don't know if whatever else may have happened. Yes? Yeah. That's because his heart that was the problem with his heart. He thought, I think I can get away with this, and therefore I'm going to go for it. Whereas the right thing to do is, I don't care if I would get away with it. I'm not going to do it because it's wrong. It is wrong to do that. So even if I 100%, no question, would get away with it scot-free, I'm still not going to do it because it's wrong. But Gehazi was thinking of Gehazi and money. And he paid a dear price for that small treasure. I don't know if Elisha's answer or rhetorical question implies that there was actually more given to him or not. But the real mistake that he made was lying to get it. The greed tempted him to do it, but what he did just made up that story. That's malicious. I mean, that's premeditated, trying to take advantage of somebody. He knew that he would give it to him if he said, Elisha, the man of God, wants it. So he brought him into it. He sent me here to get this for this noble cause, you see. these two young men from the sons of the prophets. Sons of the prophets came, and they're in need. See, the whole thing was just a filthy lie. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, it makes you wonder if that literally is what it is saying there. It also makes you wonder if he would repent, if that would be reversed, and whether or not he did repent. We don't have the full story. I hope he did. Surely, the seeds that were planted during his time with Elisha, something may have been there. But at the same time, he may have been in so much despair like Judas that he robbed himself of a chance to make it right. We just don't know. Won't know till we know. But what we do know is we don't need to do what he did. We don't need to do what any three of these men did, except maybe be terrified when we know that we're not right with God. But hopefully that will lead us, rather than saying, how many times has somebody been, their conscience pricked by the Bible study or the sermon, but they fight it until time to leave, and as soon as they walk out the doors, never think of it again. Gone. All I got to do is make it out the doors, and I won't be thinking about it anymore. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's good. Rather scare somebody into heaven than, what was the rest of it? Let somebody go to hell. Yeah. Comfort them into hell, Rather scare them into heaven, that's true. Snatch them out of that fire. So, how do we respond to the truth? Whether it's teaching, like Felix and Festus got to hear from the Apostle Paul, no less, or whether it's example, like Gehazi got with Elisha. In both cases, we ought to be moved to better action, appropriate action, obedience by teaching and by example, rather than resisting it and holding on to whatever else. All right, next week, Lord willing, Hagar, at least. I'm not certain whether she will get the time all to herself or whether we can include somebody else. But there is quite a bit to say about her, I think. But either way, we'll at least look at Hagar and maybe somebody else. We'll see. If anybody needs to respond to the invitation, unlike Felix, unlike Festus, but actually the lesson is still there. Now is the day. Now is the time of salvation. Always now.